London British Prime Minister Theresa May declined to rule out firing outspoken Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, as she said was in control of her country's strategy for Brexit. Asked directly by Sky News whether Johnson should be ousted for freelancing on how Britain should leave the European Union, Mrs May ducked the question and gave the tepid endorsement that he was doing good work as her top diplomat. British Prime Minister Theresa May, left, speaks at a UN side panel next to UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in New York on Tuesday. Photo app Boris and others are all very clear about the destination we have as a country, and that is getting that deep and special relationship with the EU when we leave, Mrs May said in New York, where she and Mr Johnson are attending meetings of the United Nations. Mrs May spoke as media reports gave conflicting reports over Mr Johnson's future days after he released her 4,200-word opus on his vision for Brexit that took a harder line than others in the government. As the Prime Minister prepares to deliver her own vision for the divorce on Friday, the London Telegraph reported that Mr Johnson, former London mayor and the figurehead of last year's Leave campaign, may resign before the end of the week if he doesn't like the contents of her speech. He told reporters after a jog in New York that he would quit, and Mrs May's spokesman said he would be still in the same job by the weekend. He and Mrs May are staying in the same hotel in New York. At the heart of their current differences is whether Mrs May will sanction paying the EU for continued access to its single market for goods and services, either for a temporary period after Brexit occurs in March 2019 or perhaps even in the long term. Mrs May was coy on that subject too, saying only that in the future, year on year, we will not be sending huge sums of money into the European Union. The Telegraph, a conservative-leaning newspaper for which Mr Johnson used to write, reported that he was ready to walk out if the PM embraced a Swiss model for Brexit in which the UK pays for trade. She's due to flesh out her thinking on Friday in Florence, Italy. British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, Centre, set out his vision for Brexit in a 4,000-word article. Photo app The Cabinet is absolutely clear about the destination we are aiming for in relation to our European negotiations, she said. We want to make sure we get the best possible deal for the United Kingdom as we leave the European Union. Late on Monday, Mr Johnson openly discussed leaving office in an interview, having shocked the political establishment late on Friday with his Telegraph essay that argued that Britain should offer cash to access its biggest market. He gave an upbeat assessment of the UK's glorious future after the split. Boris Johnson says he has a bold vision for Britain post-Brexit. Photo app Mrs May will renew her efforts to show who is in charge on Thursday, with a special cabinet meeting on the eve of her speech. She told reporters on Monday that Mr Johnson's article wasn't authorised, and that she was in control. Mr Johnson's manoeuvres have thrown the plans for her speech into disarray. She had been hoping to break the deadlock in negotiations, which have stalled over the question of the UK's divorce settlement. Instead, she may have to protect her flank against attacks from Eurosceptics. Mrs May's authority over the Conservative Party was shredded after she called a snap election and lost her majority in June. Colleagues including Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Hammond, who wants to maintain ties to Europe and was previously shut out by Mrs May, have now gained greater clout. Mr Johnson released his Brexit vision just as the rest of the cabinet was mostly coming together around a common stance for the split. His foray risks the wrath of colleagues as he is perceived as putting his own ambitions ahead of government unity. Mrs May needs to make a political calculation if she can afford to let go of him or if she still needs his stamp of approval. There are rules called collective responsibility, former Tory Chancellor Kenneth Clarke told BBC Radio 4. Sounding off in this way is completely unacceptable. Unfortunately, after the general election it's difficult for her to sack him. Meanwhile, former Prime Minister Tony Blair continued to argue for Brexit to be reversed. He told Bloomberg there is a 30% chance that the split doesn't happen. I still have some difficulty seeing how, after the general election which produced a hung parliament in the UK, this government is going to get its form of Brexit through, he said. Bloomberg.